Life of Jesus, a devotional study by Melva Purkis. A Life of Jesus, Section 3, Chapter 5, The Pool of Bethesda. It is not difficult for us to imagine the mixed feelings with which Jesus would attend the successive feasts at the temple. The desire to go to his Father's house would be tempered by sadness at the things he saw and the men who ministered there. On his previous visit, Jesus had risen in indignation against the greed and profanity in the temple courts. He had actively protested against the money changers and the bartering merchants whose hoarse cries rang out over the city. The temple glittered in the sunshine, its rabbis taught endless sophistries in its cloisters, its priests impersonally accepted the sacrifices, its Sadducees received one another with formal dignity. But God was not in their thoughts, and his glory had departed from their midst. In the shadow of the north wall of the temple, behind the stalls of the merchants near the sheep gate, there was a scene which was strangely remote from the activity of the temple, a scene which revealed human suffering at its saddest level. On the steps of a great five-arched portico overlooking the Pool of Bethesda crowded a multitude of people in every stage of disease and impotence. Those who were not blind watched the water below them with pathetic intensity. The pool was the subject of a well-known but uncommon physical phenomenon which caused it to bubble up at intervals. It had received and maintained the reputation of being able to cure the first infirm body which made contact with it after its disturbance. It is not hard to see how the superstition had gained credence. The power of faith over the body, particularly in cases of nervous disorders, is too well known to need emphasis. There were enough apparent cures to draw sufferers to its edge in the hope that they might be the subjects of what they believed to be angelic ministration. The two scenes within the city bore no relation to one another. High on the hill of Zion, the immaculately robed priests observed the temple ritual aloof and impersonal. In the shadows of its walls, the halt, the blind, and the withered waited for the movement of the water. Jesus, attending the feasts at Jerusalem, left the temple and, making his way through the thronged streets in the northeast corner of the city, stood in the midst of the suffering, expectant multitude. The water had not yet stirred, and the atmosphere was tense and silent as the impotent and their friends and relatives concentrated with a selfishness born out of the greatness of their pain and need for the first shimmer of movement. Jesus watched the pitiful sight until at last he found the saddest case of all. A man was lying on the steps with no one to assist him. For 38 years he had endured his infirmity. Despair was written on his face. Jesus stood over the man, but his presence awakened no response. The man did not know him, had no faith in him, and made no demands of him. Suddenly he heard a voice addressing him. "Wilt thou be made whole?" He looked up at Jesus. Had his case not been so hopeless, he would have resented an interruption that might have robbed him of his chance of healing. The despair in his eyes was emphasized in his voice. What faith he had still lingered in the black waters below him. "Sir, I have no man when the water is troubled to put me into the pool. But while I am coming, another steppeth down before me." Had the man at last found a friend who would lead him down to the water's brim? and find a place for him among those that crowded the lowest step? But Jesus directed his thoughts from such lowly expectation. His clear, strong command rang out, "Rise, take up thy bed and walk." Instinctively the man obeyed. He bent down and rolled up his pallet and stood up. He found a freedom of movement he had not known for nearly 40 years. He turned to face the one he had obeyed, but Jesus had gone. We can imagine the consternation that ensued. All eyes were turned up towards this chronic invalid, the unhappiest of them all, now moving among them with tears of joy rolling down his cheeks. The waters below bubbled and subsided unnoticed. There was a greater source of power and healing in Israel. The healed man walked through the streets toward the temple. Perhaps he was obeying the unrecorded instructions of Jesus. Perhaps he was anxious to express his gratitude to God in worship and sacrifice. It was typical of the rulers that when they saw this familiar figure no longer dragging himself painfully along, but walking with quick, eager steps, they should overlook the transformation and remember only that it was the Sabbath day. In carrying his bed, he was guilty of bearing a burden. Had they greater insight, they would have been quick to discern that his bed truly had been a burden for 38 years. But it was not so on this glorious Sabbath. In answer to their angry questions, the man could only say that he was obeying the instructions of one who had made him whole. He could give them no information concerning the identity of his benefactor. But the healed and the healer came face to face in the temple, and there, appropriately, Jesus completed the cure he had begun on the steps of Bethesda. Characteristically, the spiritual remedy followed the natural one. "Behold, thou art made whole. Sin no more, lest a worse thing come unto thee." Thus the healed man learned that it was Jesus who had cured him. He could show his gratitude by doing his part towards the complete healing which Jesus desired. But the immediate result was that he could now proclaim to those who asked him who it was that had made him whole. The result of this revelation was an issue between the healer and the ruler of the temple. It led to the first complete statement of Jesus concerning his messiahship and his relationship with God, set forth with clearness and decision, and the first occasion upon which his death was sought by his enemies. The conflict was to be long and bitter. Finally, it was to be expedient that Christ should die for the people, but that hour was not yet. It is in the verbal conflict which ensued that we see the true meaning of the miracle and understand why John, moved by the Spirit, selected it as one of the 8 signs of his gospel. The first issue was briefly dismissed. It was the subject of the Sabbath, and in answer to that challenge, Jesus said quite simply, "My Father worketh hitherto, and I work." As he so often did, Jesus, in a brief sentence, widened and deepened the whole conception of the problem, and exposed the futility of the endless arguments and meticulous pronouncements of the scribes. He showed them by implication that God rested on the Sabbath day for the blessing of mankind. He blessed it and sanctified it. To sanctify is to set apart for his service. Had not he thus truly kept the Sabbath? Had he not blessed this impotent man with physical and spiritual health? But in justifying his action, he had exposed himself to a much more serious charge. Therefore the Jews sought the more to kill him, because he had not only broken the Sabbath, but also said that God was his Father, making himself equal with God. In answering that charge, Jesus both fully revealed himself and his mission, and indicted his accusers. He also plainly showed the connection between his case against the religious leaders and his healing of the impotent man. We see why he left the temple and went down among the suffering people. His words are not so much an angry denunciation as a sad recognition of a fact. He began at a point which immediately laid bare their fundamental mistake. You, he said in effect, have only seen a man carrying a bed on the Sabbath. You knew, but ignored the fact that the man had been the subject of divine restoration. I have given that man his new life, but of myself I can do nothing. I have done it because I am the Son of God, and I have been sent to identify myself with my Father's will. This restored man is the earnest of far greater works, because the whole purpose of God is concealed in my obedience. The time will come when they that are in the grave shall hear my voice and come forth. You sent a deputation into the wilderness to find out the burden of John's message. John bore witness of me, but I have a greater witness than John's. At this moment the evidence stands before you in my Father's work. In spite of all your efforts to study and teach the Scriptures, you have not heard the voice of God. If you had, you would receive me. You search the Scriptures because in them you know you have eternal life, but that is only true because they testify of me, and you do not come to me that you might have life. You put your trust in Moses. But Moses condemns you because he leads you to me and you reject me. The action of Jesus in turning from the temple to Bethesda assumes a new significance in the light of his words. The true scene of his ministry was not among the subtle analysts of the law, but in the midst of suffering humanity, which knew only the greatness of its need and sought salvation with a faith which had degenerated into superstition. Into the midst he came, seeking one for whom there was no eye to pity and no arm to save. Without a plea for help, he came in his grace to bring salvation. It was altogether right that the next meeting should be in his Father's house. It was right that the healed man should give the answer to those who asked him that Christ hath made him whole. It was inevitable that persecution should follow. This visit to Jerusalem was a microcosm of the history of the coming of the Son of God into the world. It identified those who received him not, and was an earnest of the new relationship which was promised to those who welcomed him.